So I wrote a 2-hour speech here.
All right.
I'm only going to give a small portion of it, but what's that old joke that you want me to give a 10-minute speech on a subject that I know very well? I'll need 2 months to prepare. But if you want me to talk for 2 hours, I'm ready now. So tonight's lesson is lesson 11, and that is taking spiritual inventory, part 2. In last week's lesson, we asked some hard questions about our relationships, our priorities, our attitudes, and our integrity. We looked into how our sin and shortcomings contributed to the negative results in these areas of our lives. We asked ourselves how others have hurt us and whether we are still holding a grudge or even trying to hurt them back out of revenge and resentment. We asked if we're trying to externalize the blame for our own failings onto others. We asked about how our fears, anxieties, and resentments and hang-ups are still holding us back from being the best versions of ourselves, or worse, continuing to sabotage us on a daily basis, making us angry, dishonest, hypercritical, ungrateful, and intemperate, using escapes into substance abuse or other destructive habits that further erode our sense of self and undermine our capacity to recover and live a life in which we thrive. It was a pretty brutal session. It took very seriously the prayer in Psalm 139. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me into the way of the everlasting. I got to hand it to you, folks. It takes a lot of guts to open yourselves like that. I'm sure it was a terribly painful session for all of you. I'm sorry I missed it. But in his amazing book, The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis points out that we can ignore all kinds of things. We can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists on being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pains. Pain is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. There's a strange paradox in pain. If you truly wish to overcome your pain and suffering, you must go to where the pain is and attend to it. This is especially true of psychological pain. Too often we try to numb, drown, or escape the pain with intoxicants or bad habits. But experts on trauma tell us that we must listen to the voice inside the wound. It will give you the meaning of your suffering and show you the way to heal it with grace. This is particularly true of trauma. The place of your greatest suffering will become the stage for your greatest ministry, your greatest redemption. But this is very, very difficult to do alone, and that's why we're here at Celebrate Recovery. People who haven't suffered in life do not know what they're missing. These people often end up becoming entitled people who abuse those who don't gratify them, or they fold when the going gets tough. That's why Christ says, how blessed are those who mourn? How blessed are those who are poor in spirit? People who have suffered understand and appreciate joy and happiness far better than those who've had it good all their lives. Perhaps that's why, as a society, we seem to be getting unhappier the richer we get. We have it so good today that maybe we haven't learned perhaps the greatest lessons Jesus came to teach us. How to suffer with grace, how to strengthen our faith, be resilient in the face of struggle, and how to love our neighbors as ourselves. Now, all the people in this room know suffering, and we have faith in our Lord. But we sometimes struggle with having grace and being resilient. That's the hard part, isn't it? Sometimes it's even easier to love others, people we admire, for example, and it's almost impossible to love ourselves. But Christ told us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And G.K. Chesterton reminds us that the Bible also tells us to love our neighbors as well as our enemies, probably because generally they're the same people. We often hear the recommendation, know thyself. But this is actually one of the toughest things any human can do. Not only are humans the most astonishingly complex and complicated things in the cosmos, but we often haven't the slightest understanding of the things that we actually do. Think of St. Paul, who said in Romans 7:15, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. If the greatest saint of Christianity, if the author of the majority of the New Testament outside the Gospels can't understand himself, what chance do we troubled souls here at Celebrate Recovery have, right? Well, I've got good news for you. The work that St. Paul began in trying to understand why we do these foolish things has continued apace for 2,000 years, and we have made some tremendous gains in this field of human study. It is a great time to be alive. Indeed, we can truly say that psychotherapy or psychology wasn't really even invented until 150 years ago. Okay? And in just the last 40 years, there has been an explosion in our understanding of how our minds work. The field is still going through growing pains, but the breakthrough discoveries and advancements in the last 15 years are staggering, even mind-boggling. We need only open our minds to them in order to take advantage of this tremendous bequest of insight and wisdom. So tonight's lesson says that the most difficult thing to open is a closed mind. And while that may be true, we should also guard against the opposite extreme of being so open-minded that our brains fall out. So open your minds tonight. I'm going to share with you some of the most mind-blowing discoveries made in the past couple decades in the study of the human mind and psyche. One of the greatest advancements in psychology took shape in the late 80s when the mindfulness movement took shape. At about the same time, the idea of emotional intelligence also landed like a bombshell on the psychological scene. Although many phenomenologists like Dietrich von Hildebrand were pioneers into the realm of emotion, the affective sphere, or what the poets have always called just the heart, emotions have always kind of been treated as coming from a secondary, lower place in the psyche that our rational thinking had to somehow subdue. Well, we now know that the intelligence of the reasonable, rational kind is actually overrated. That intelligent people in particular overvalue intelligence. And now we know that what's in a man's heart tells us more about him than anything. And that emotional intelligence is actually a more valuable commodity, if we're to use such a crass word, than just mere rationality, okay? Business people are looking for folks that have emotional intelligence more than just mere rational intelligence. But first, let's discuss mindfulness. I'll use Daniel Siegel's example of the wheel of awareness. Has anybody heard of this term? This is really, I think this is a breakthrough idea. It's pretty simple. I want you to picture in your mind's eye a bicycle wheel. Your conscious mind is the hub of that wheel, the still point on the turning world. Your mind, if it is mindful, can direct its attention down any of the spokes and point your awareness to any point on that circle of awareness. You can be aware of this thing or that thing. You can be aware of this or that memory. You can pay attention to all sorts of things that are not only out there in the world, but inside your own world as well. But here's the rub. You have the capacity to change the direction of your awareness. You don't have to spend your time thinking about the things that are on the wheel, and you can think about other things. What's more is your mind can become mindfully aware that the things, especially the things like thoughts and emotions, are merely thoughts and emotions. You don't have to get stuck on the wheel thinking about these things. You have the capacity to say to yourself, that's just an emotion that I'm feeling. I don't have to act upon it. It might just pass. You don't have to believe everything you think. And if you're like me, most of the things you think are pretty stupid anyways, so it's better not to act upon them. Furthermore, most of the emotions that I feel are stupid and self-absorbed, so I don't want them to override my good sense and upset my stability anyways. This being aware of ourselves is, in short, what we call being mindful. This is mindfulness. It's a detached way of seeing yourself. It's like going through life with a second self, one who is a cool-headed advisor, who is an astute spectator, and a cautious co-pilot. He teaches us to respond productively and positively rather than merely reacting recklessly and possibly destructively to all the things that are spinning around on our wheel of awareness. The more you learn the art of awareness, the more you learn the art of mindfulness, the more that center hub grows and the more powerful you become. Like the water at the depth of the sea, you will develop a stillness that can look up and back at and even laugh at the frantic waves that are sloshing around on the surface. When you direct your soul from that depth, it's more than just waves crashing into one another. It's a storm surge that can move mountains, so to speak. So developing this capacity is particularly important for those of us struggling with the problems that we're facing here at Celebrate Recovery, which is not just for people dealing with substance abuse, but for people with PTSD, grief of loss, physical and mental abuse, codependency, and other hurts and hang-ups and bad habits that we're trying to overcome. To be able to just notice when we are passing through a storm, to know that it's just wild emotions all around us, and to know that this too shall pass, that we don't necessarily have to react to it, and to know and to learn how to better respond are all gifts of grace for which we're praying and we're trying to develop. When you open your heart to God's grace, your hub in the center will grow. And not just your mind will get sharper, but your heart grows as also. You develop a compassion, not only for yourself, but for others. You're able to observe others in a loving and empathetic way. You connect better because instead of frantically reacting to the stimulus all around yourself, you can focus on them and what they are really needing from you. You grow a wise heart. Your emotional intelligence grows. Your reservoir of love fills up. And you can pour out your love and understanding in a directed way, rather than having what little you have spill out here and there as if you were carrying a leaky bucket up a hill. Having this wheel of awareness is going to be important because I'm now going to step back into the shadow. I'm going to ask you to still yourself for this next part. I need to educate you tonight about attachment theory. It is now quite clear, but to my mind still not discussed widely enough, how important secure attachment is to our mental health. Here again, I reference Siegel's Mind Sight. There's an old scientific experiment that has now been performed hundreds of times on thousands of one-year-old children, which takes a look at how these children behave when they're in a strange situation of separation, of being separated from their mother and being left with a stranger alone in a room full of toys. Okay? There are essentially 4 different ways that these kids reacted, patterns of behavior when they were reunited with their mother. 60% of them, a little over 60% of them, showed clear signs of missing their mother, often crying, and they actively greeted her when she returned with hugs and kisses, and then they settled down quickly and began playing with the toys in the room. This was labeled secure attachment, 60+%. About 20% of the toddlers demonstrated avoidant attachment. They showed no signs of distress when she was gone, and they played with the toys and ignored or avoided her when she returned. Another 10% demonstrated ambivalent attachment. The kids were distressed before, during, and after their separation. The reuniting did not settle the children. They showed a kind of overactivation in the attachment circuitry. Another 10% demonstrated disorganized attachment. It is difficult to watch what happens when these kids are reunited with their mother. They look terrified. They approach their mother, but then withdraw. They freeze, maybe, or they fall down. They cannot find any strategy to cope with the separation or the reuniting. The first three kinds of attachment at least had a developed coping strategy of dealing with their mom, but the last one couldn't find a coping strategy. If these attachment patterns are not repaired, these early patterns persist throughout the child's life. Now, this experiment wasn't just done in the room the day that they were separated. There had been countless visits to the homes of the participants to ascertain the parenting style prior to the day of experiment. As you might imagine, the kids who had secure attachment with their parents, had sensitive parents who were attuned to the kids' needs and emotions, had a great feedback loop of love flowing. When we have secure attachment with our parents, we miss them. We enjoy being reunited with them. And then we go about the business of confidently living our own lives. We have great capacity to form other attachments, to love and be loved by others. But where does that leave the rest of us 40%? 20% of the kids who had avoidant attachment did not have responsive, attuned mothers at home. These kids came to believe, well, mother doesn't soothe me when I'm sad or angry. Why should I care whether she's here or not? Avoidance is an adaptation to deal with the lack of attachment. These were probably the ones who were allowed to cry it out on their own in daycare. 10% of the kids with ambivalent attachment had parents that were inconsistent with their sensitivity, affection, and varied in their responses to the baby. And 10% they didn't know where to think, they didn't know where mom and dad were coming from. 10% of the kids with disorganized attachment had terribly dysfunctional homes. I'm sure that's no surprise. 80% of the kids from high-risk homes exhibited this kind of attachment. I'd like for you just to take an extra second to think about what that means for large swaths of our country today. What if you had a parent who was a narcissist who didn't care about your feelings, your needs, or wants, but instead just insisted that you attend to his need for attention, affirmation, affection, and admiration? What if you had a parent abuse you if you didn't gratify her? What if you had a parent who was a ferocious fault finder who was constantly criticizing your every move? What if your parents had free-floating anger and made you a scapegoat constantly as a means of catharsis for their frustration and resentment at their boss, their parents, or their world? What if one of your parents presented themselves as a pillar of the community outside the home, but at home they were a rageaholic who would imprison the family for hours, several times a week, to denigrate and demean the children and wife? What if you were not allowed to express your emotions, or worse, you were mocked for having them? What if you were parentified? In other words, you had to completely give up being a kid, and you had to be the soothing one for the parent. What if you were punished for trying to assert yourself, your rights, or your desires? What if your parents reserved their worst punishment for you when you protested their abuse? What if your siblings imitated your abusive parents and made you their scapegoat and whipping boy? Do you think you might have attachment problems? What if you were not taught how to avoid reenacting these kinds of relationships in your adulthood, and you attracted friends who denigrated you, co-workers that took advantage of you, or spouses who reenacted the same behaviors but in such different ways that you couldn't realize that you were falling prey to the repetition compulsion? These types of traumatic childhoods result in what Pete Walker elegantly describes as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, complex PTSD. People who are survivors of such childhoods often don't think of themselves as abused because they weren't sexually or physically abused. They think, well, at least I didn't have it as bad as that friend of mine who gets the belt every week. But it is precisely because of this minimization that the trauma can go even deeper and become more difficult to detect and heal. Walker says that in a perverse, ironic way, my parents' physical abuse of me was a blessing, for it was so blatant that my attempt to suppress, rationalize, and make light or laugh it off lost its power by the time he had reached adolescence. He said, I was able to see my father for the bully that he really was. Complex PTSD, I believe, is one of the most important developments in developmental psychology in the last 20 years. And I believe it takes attachment theory and develops it out, how bad parental attachment manifests itself in every adult. I suspect that most of the people who find their way into Celebrate Recovery are dealing at base with abuse and attachment disorders that began in their childhood. What happens when you are raised in an environment like this is that the child develops a harsh inner critic that is always yammering at the child. Now, Freud called this the superego, and we all have this voice working at the threshold of our consciousness. It is the voice of our parents, our peers, and our pop culture. It's always telling us what to do in order to be accepted and liked, and how to achieve our goals. But with a child who has complex PTSD, it becomes a terribly harsh critic that is constantly cutting down the ego, cutting that child down to size, and compelling certain behaviors. Often this inner critic becomes an outer critic also. It begins to project itself onto others, often mimicking their parents' bad behavior. It goes around criticizing others, trying to control or perfect others, demonizing others, and blaming them for their own problems. Learning how to recognize this inner critic and learning how to shrink its influence so that our own healthy ego can rise to fill that space is one of the key steps on the road to recovery from complex PTSD. But let me take a step back and define CPTSD for you. By its fruits it shall be known. 5 of its most common and troublesome features are emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self-abandonment, a vicious inner critic, and social anxiety. Now here at Celebrate Recovery, we've talked a lot about toxic shame and social anxieties, but let me zero in on emotional flashbacks. Emotional flashbacks, Walker tells us, are sudden and often prolonged regressions into overwhelming feeling states of being an abused or abandoned child, which can include overwhelming fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, and depression. And they also trigger our fight and flight instincts. One of the most important tools for handling a flashback we've already discussed, mindfulness. Just being able to recognize that you're having a flashback and that you're being swamped with emotion is a big first step in reducing these flashbacks' power over you. Knowing that you can stand strong in the hub while the storm of emotion is raging all around the rim of your circle of awareness is key to getting through them. Find your center. Be patient. Pray. You're not really in danger at this moment. Take a time out. This too shall pass. Now I'm going to shift into the 4 F's of a response. Now most people know 2 of them. I've already mentioned them, fight and flight. But can anybody name the other 2? Anybody heard this? Freeze, excellent. That's usually what people get. That's the 3rd one. And the 4th one is fawn. Fawn. For a bonus, can anyone guess the 5th? Which is kind of extra credit here. It's faint. And these goats that faint, we're talking something like that. These are the people who faint in front of oncoming traffic. People with secure attachments and proper, well-rounded education develop the capacity to know when and how to do all 4. But most of us, even if we don't have CPTSD, have a go-to response and then a backup plan. When we don't have secure attachment, usually we have a go-to and a backup plan, but we do not do them right. We do them in very disordered and destructive ways. What's that? Freaking out is not a good one. You do not have to be among the 40% of us who have attachment issues to learn from this part of the program. A fight response is triggered when a person suddenly responds aggressively to something threatening. A flight response, on the other hand, is triggered when a person responds to a perceived threat by fleeing or symbolically by launching into hyperactivity. A freeze response is triggered when a person, realizing that resistance is futile, gives up, numbs out into dissociation and or collapses, like faint, as if accepting the inevitability of being hurt. A fawn response is triggered when a person responds to threat by trying to be pleasing or helpful in order to appease or forestall the attacker. This fourfold response potential will be referred to as the 4Fs. Traumatized children often overgravitate to one of these response patterns to survive. And as time passes, these 4 modes become elaborated into entrenched and unhealthy forms of defensive structures. Fight becomes narcissism. Flight becomes ADHD or obsessive compulsive disorder. Freeze becomes dissociative personality disorder or ADD. They know how coolly to change the channel. And of course, Fawn, they become codependents. These coping structures help children survive their bad childhoods, but leave them limited and narrow in how they respond to the rest of their life. Worse, they get locked into these patterns in adulthood, and instead of developing the ability to discern how and when to and best to respond from each of the 4 ways, they only have one real response. And it happens subconsciously. They're not aware that there are other options. When we have attachment disorders as children, we can develop excessive reliance on the 4Fs as an unconscious attempt to cope with constant danger. These are strategies to strengthen the illusion that our abusive parents really do care about us. Often, when we reach adulthood, those of us with bad childhoods are ambivalent about real intimacy because closeness frightens us and can trigger flashbacks into the abuse that we received as kids. If we are not allowed to show our feelings or mock for them when we were children, let me just say that again. If we were not allowed to show our feelings or we were mocked for them when we were showing our feelings, we are going to struggle mightily showing our emotions to our intimates and our friends. Fight types avoid real intimacy by alienating others with angry and controlling demands for unconditional love. This unrealistic demand to have their unmet childhood needs met destroys the possibility for intimacy. Furthermore, fight types are often deluded narcissists who see themselves as perfect, and they see other people as the ones who need to be perfected. Many flight types, they stay perpetually busy and industrious to avoid being triggered into deeper relationships, deeper relating. These are often the perfectionists who work obsessively to perfect themselves, hoping to someday become worthy enough of the love they didn't get from their parents. They often appear to be like narcissists because they're wearing a mask to display their perfect persona, but they're more likely to suffer from anxiety disorders like ADHD and OCD. Many freeze types hide away in their rooms and reveries, fully convinced that the world of relating holds nothing for them. They are disassociatives who escape into fantasy, drugs, or online relations that are safer but less real. And finally, many fawn types avoid emotional investment and potential disappointment by barely showing themselves. They hide behind their helpful, happy personas, and they overlisten, they overelicit, they overdo for the other. Thus, they get walked all over by others. They get doormatted throughout their lives, and they create the very rejection they fear the most. Things get really interesting when we begin looking at the various hybrids that come from each of these structures. But let me pivot away from the 4Fs and get back to tonight's Celebrate Recovery lesson. Much of the lesson in developing our spiritual inventories asks us about how our family has hurt and mistreated us. Maybe you had a good childhood but ended up in a bad relationship, which caused some of the same attachment problems, same kind of traumas that CPST did to children. The lesson asks you about whether you are hurting others in the same way that you were hurt. Hurt people hurt people. Are you breaking or perpetuating this cycle of trauma? Are you hurting yourself, sabotaging yourself with bad habits, harmful thoughts, corruptive media, and toxic relationships? Are you living in denial about these things? Now, one thing I hope I've done tonight is to show you that many of our problems got their start in our upbringing. I would suggest that very few of us in CR have had loving, attuned, sensitive parents who affirmed us and created a space of safety and love in which we could always return for help as we grew up. But knowing how all this mess got started does not excuse us from having to clean up the mess in our own lives. But hopefully, it helps you discard some of that toxic shame you've been carrying around. It helps you shrink your inner critic and be compassionate towards yourself. Hopefully, I've helped you see that you don't have to be swamped every time the sea of emotions comes pouring in, or be swept along by your 4F responses. You can thought stop that stuff. Another step in healing is angering out these things, verbally ventilating about these wounds in our soul that were put there in childhood. And that's what our breakout groups are for here in Celebrate Recovery. So as we enter the Christmas season here, I want to make this point that you're in a safe space to do that here, okay? And let me remind you that the greatest forgiveness you can ever give to someone is the forgiveness that you give to the one who should be asking you for their forgiveness, but they never ask for it. This Christmas, even though you may not yet be able to forgive them, you may be a long way from really being able to forgive those in your family that have hurt you. Try to act as if you do. Realize that they were probably hurt by their parents. They had their own hurts and hang-ups. To know all is to forgive all. And although we'll always fall short of knowing even very little on this side of eternity, we can learn to forgive as if we know what shadow is inside of every other person. And forgive them, and to know that's that shadow, it's that evil in them that caused them to hurt us. And it enables us to forgive them. And so with that, I'm just going to wish you all the best of Christmas, and see you in the new year.